All right. So I'm Howard Friedman. I'm the director of the Jewish Community Library, which is a program of Jewish Learning Works. And I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. It's great to have such a large number of people interested in this topic. I want to thank the Friends of the Jewish Community Library for enabling us to do what we do at the library, and especially Allison Green for making tonight's event possible. If you'd like to join the Friends, please do go to www.friendsofthejcl.org. And most of all, I want to thank Doron Shapira for being with us here tonight and sharing his memories. Doron is the longtime cantor at Peninsula Sinai Congregation in Foster City. He's a veteran Bay Area Jewish educator, and he is a really great person. So it's really a great pleasure for me to be spending evening with him as well as you.
Thank you.
Sure, it's my great pleasure. And so before we begin, just some quick technical notes. There is automated closed captioning that can be accessed by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen and then selecting Show Subtitles. And you can also turn off those subtitles by clicking the CC button and choosing Hide Subtitles. Because we have a large number of people here, everybody will be muted during the main part of the program. You can absolutely use the chat function to communicate, to ask questions that can be answered later on, and there may be some opportunity for some sharing. So I'm going to go ahead and start. I'm not the most competent in sharing here, so I'm going to take just a wee second, get this going. And okay, can you see that? Great.
Yes, we're good.
Okay, good. So at the Mission Minyan, which has met at the Women's Building on 18th Street for many years, it's long been a tradition on the day of Simchat Torah to parade the Torah scrolls down the block to dance with them in front of the old congregation B'nai David building, sort of linking today's Jewish life in the mission with yesterday's. But what exactly was this place? It's a really hard question for people like me who are relatively new to San Francisco. And for me, relatively new means 33 years. But B'nai David, I imagine that it's one of the most wondered at Jewish landmarks in San Francisco. And I can only imagine how many people have asked this question. It's actually not a very easy one to answer. There is actually nothing written about the Jews in the Mission District in any of the histories of Jews in San Francisco, including Fred Rosenbaum's great work, The Cosmopolitans. To try to answer this question, I'm going to provide a skeletal history, and then that will be followed by reflections from Cantor Doron Shapira, who is really one of the few people to have experienced B'nai David in its final days as a living synagogue. I'll then briefly discuss a few other extinct synagogues in San Francisco for those who are interested in staying. San Francisco's Jewish history is famously defined by those who came from German-speaking lands in the mid-19th century and often achieved great social and economic success. But to the chagrin of the German Jewish establishment, who wanted to keep their good footing in the city secure, Yiddish-speaking East European Jews did begin arriving in the latter part of the 19th century. They settled overwhelmingly in small streets in the South of Market area, where there came to be a concentration of about 5,000 mostly Orthodox immigrant Jews, along with synagogues, butcher shops, and bakeries. But some settled elsewhere, including the Mission District. Mission Congregation B'nai David was incorporated in 1894 with the intention of building a synagogue. As the notice here mentions, holidays were celebrated at the Mission Opera Hall, which was on Mission at 17th Street, but regular services were in a rented facility at Mission and 16th. Although B'nai David was incorporated a year earlier, this article from 1895 describing the dedication of a new Sefer Torah claims that the congregation had actually been in existence for 9 years. It notes that the congregation B'nai David was formed in order, this quote, that those living far out in the mission might have services near them, as many could not attend if they had to go to the downtown synagogues. Here's an example of a confirmation notice from the shul from 1897. Then came the earthquake and fire of 1906, and nearly all of those 5,000 Jews living south of Market were now suddenly homeless. Most moved to the Fillmore District, which was untouched by the fire and which would soon become the epicenter of East European Jewish life in San Francisco. And some moved to the Portola District, and some moved to the Mission, much of which had been spared from the fire. Both buildings that had been used by B'nai David were within the area that was totaled by the fire. So Jews in the Mission District, who were now much more numerous than they were prior to 1906, needed a new place to worship. This is from the Chronicle in April 1907. The Mission Congregation B'nai David, at a meeting held last Sunday in New Club Hall, Howard and 21st Street, decided to build a synagogue and bathhouse in conformity with the Mosaic laws called Mikveh Israel at 19th and Valencia Street. Many Israelites have taken up their abode in the Mission District who formerly resided in the section south of Market Street between 3rd and 9th Streets. When the fire of last year destroyed their homes, they settled in the Mission temporarily, as they then supposed. They have now resided in the Mission for nearly 1.5 years and prefer to remain in that section. So here's the record of the transfer of property on 19th Street to the congregation in 1907. You can see in this photograph what the neighborhood looked like in the aftermath of the earthquake and fire. This is Valencia between 18th and 19th Streets. The Mission District fire was contained at 20th Street to the south and Dolores to the west. So these blocks would be the site of, to the left is where Congregation B'nai David would end up being. To the right, you see where the women's building would likely would end up being. Meanwhile, Mikveh Israel was actually a different organization. Here's an announcement of its incorporation in 1897. And here's a picture of Mikveh Israel's president, S. Caro. The cornerstone for the new building was laid on April 19th, 1908. Dramatically, this article notes that the dedication occurred 2 years to the day and hour from when the congregation's home at 16th and Mission was destroyed by fire. Services, which were strictly Orthodox, began as soon as the building was completed. And in 1910, the two organizations, B'nai David and Mikveh Israel, consolidated. Given the already close relationship of the two, this would seem to me a more minor occurrence, but apparently it was not. You can see this big splash in the San Francisco Call. And here's a portion in greater detail. It's really hard to read the text, but it says, for the first time in the history of the Jewish religion in San Francisco, rabbis representing the 4 large congregations in the city will speak from the same platform tonight at the services in honor of the consolidation of the Mission Congregation B'nai David and Chevra Mikveh Israel. So that means that the rabbis from Shereth Israel, Emmanuel, Olabei Shalom, and Beth Israel all came to B'nai David to celebrate this merger. So I've discussed the synagogue, but not really the mikveh, which is the ritual bath used by observant Jews. For many decades, the building housed the only mikveh in Northern California, and people came from Oregon and Nevada to use it. And for the mandated fresh water portion for the mikveh, they actually brought in snow from the Sierras. The synagogue was remodeled and expanded in 1926. Here's an article about the rededication in the Chronicle, in which the lovely head of the reception committee is given more space on the page than the article itself. In the article, it's noted that the key to the synagogue, or according to the headline, the church, was being given by Yehudi Menuhin, the child violin prodigy who lived in the Fillmore district. Among the synagogue's attendees were many of the merchants who ran shops in the Mission. The Mission District had many Jewish shop owners, such as Redlick's, which was home to the 17 Reasons Why sign that many of you probably remember, and Sharon's, which is one of those original Jewish stores established by neighborhood residents at the beginning of the 20th century, and which is still run by the family on Valencia and 18th, just a block and a half from B'nai David. So this is how it looked in 1958. The shul did not have anything resembling a full-time rabbi. The rabbinical duties were carried out for quite a while by Mayor Hirsch, who was born in Lithuania and ordained there. He came to San Francisco to lead Anshe Sfard in the Fillmore district. And here's a picture of Rabbi Hirsch with barrels of sacramental kosher wine during Prohibition, as he was actually a kosher winemaker as well. His father-in-law, David Radinsky, grew kosher grapes in Napa that then Rabbi Hirsch made into wine. I had the privilege of speaking with two people who attended the synagogue during the late 1930s, and they noted that Rabbi Hirsch always gave his sermons exclusively in Yiddish. They also noted the decline of the community, most pronouncedly in the 1940s. With the development of the Sunset and Richmond districts, many families left, and especially younger families. You can see there how this street had no trees in front of the synagogue. For some, it may be hard to imagine giving up the sun of the Mission District for the fog of the Richmond, but the lure of the newly developing Western neighborhoods was very strong, and the GI Bill helped with home loans for soldiers returning from World War II. So actually, I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to turn it over to Doron now to continue the story.
Thank you so much, Howard. And I just want to start by saying this is such a pleasure. I have, of those 33 years, I've had the privilege of knowing and on occasion working with Howard for most of them. But this is the first time we've done any kind of project or any public presentation like this. So it's a real pleasure, and I thank him. He was the inspiration behind it. And a shout out also to Noah and Rose for helping us behind the scenes, make this all come together. I had a little bit of history to share too, but I've been listening carefully, and I will try not to repeat much of what Howard said other than maybe just the very basics. And I noticed quite a few came in after we started, so maybe just as a little bit of review. But I did want to mention a little something about myself, which is, and this is how I became connected to the synagogue. I was born in Tel Aviv, Israel, and at the age of 1, my family moved, at least temporarily, to San Francisco. We're still here. I'm still here, those of us who are still alive and well. And my father, Shapira, who became active in many things in the Jewish community. I have a feeling that a few here tonight may remember him as well. And among those things was a part-time job in it would have been either late 65, we moved here in 65, or early 67, sort of a one-man show, if you will, as what I think today we'd call an executive director in the school, an education director, secretary and mikveh coordinator, all these things for this synagogue. Again, it opened in 1908, it closed in 1978. That's its entire history, those 70 years. And though I didn't think about it at the time, in a way, I play a little bit of history in it, in that the day it closed, I was there, as I often was, with my father by his side, learning things that I would later use in life and following his footsteps in many ways. But the day it closed, which would have been October of 1978, I was 14 years old. If memory serves, I was holding the last of the Torah scrolls that was coming out of the building. There was one left. And we came in, and my father closed and locked the gate, and off we went. And that put an end to the 70 years. So I guess in a way, I was the last member of this 70-year history to step out of this building, but not really. I came back, and I'll say a little bit about that towards the end. I did want to mention the Torah, by the way, did come with us to our home. And for a few months, I resided, I remember, in a closet in my bedroom. I remember just, it may seem a little silly or strange, but just feeling so safe, like sleeping in that bedroom. It eventually made its way to Sinai Memorial Chapel, if I remember correctly, who founded its next home. whatever that was. Maybe it's at Sinai still today, I'm not sure. I was going to show some photos and I'll just refer to them later, but I've got some really cool ones. Unlike what Howard did, I'd rather just show a bunch of photos a little bit towards the end about the founding of it and that kind of thing. I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Just a little trivia on that opening day that Howard referred to in 1908 at around 2 in the afternoon. If you do the research, you find not only were, I mean, there were, yes, a lot of Jews there, but the mayor of San Francisco at the time, Mayor Edward Taylor, was there. Governor James Gillette, the governor of the state of California, was at the founding of this synagogue. You can look it up. And the immediate past governor of the state of California was there as well. I'm seeing in our chat comments on the mikvah. We'll get there as well. A lot of history to this mikvah. And Yehudi, the aforementioned Yehudi Menuhin was there as well on founding day. And I'm told by sources that would know, I'll share who later, would practice there on occasion. So for that, you know, for those who don't know, there are youngsters here, you know, arguably, if not the greatest, certainly considered one of the greatest violinists of the 20th century. So a lot of interesting ancillary history in that way as well. Okay, and I would just also mention that Howard did, but what's quite different, and I would agree with Howard that these Jews did not, and still do not, get the press that a lot of the German Jews who came and from Reform backgrounds, and as San Franciscans in general, I think, know. A lot of the great museums and zoos and other things, houses of music have Jewish names on them. They were these mostly Germanic Jews of wealth. These Jews, however, in the mission, were mostly on the poorer side. Orthodox came in big numbers between 1880 to 1910. I would mention that when you do research on the synagogue, and it ain't easy, but it's out there, God bless the internet, you find time and again that people mention that by the 1930s already, I guess in a way, if I'm not getting too morose here, the beginning of the end was the last 50 years of its existence, or 40 years. In the 1930s and 1940s, demographics were already changing. And I don't mean so much the Hispanic influx, which came later, but the Jews moving to other neighborhoods. And so the synagogue already then was starting to die out in terms of its numbers. By my time, I was a little boy in the 60s, but I still remember in that decade, and certainly throughout most of the 70s, it was quite different. And there were times, High Holy Days and Simchat Torah, I know Howard mentioned, I remember in a very special way, where it was cool that there were A, women there, and B, kids there, because most of the time you didn't have either of those groups when I was growing up there. And it was a struggle to make a minyan often. I grew up in this synagogue, and for my friends who are here from Peninsula Temple Shalom, I think there are a few, that came later in my life. And for a while I was attending both, one more on Friday nights, one a suburban Reform large congregation, and one a small Orthodox one in the city. But I hung out on a regular basis on Shabbat mornings with a cast of characters that were mostly old, immigrant, Yiddish-speaking Jewish men. And looking back now, I didn't think much about it then, often being the only child, sometimes with my siblings, one or both of them, but often just myself. I remember often going with my father. I wouldn't trade those memories for anything, even though there's something to be said for growing up in a thriving synagogue with youth movements and that kind of thing. But I have memories of men, of Jews who really were born and raised, as were the clergy, in pre-Holocaust Europe. And I got a taste of that Judaism, and a cantor who sounded like the recordings I listened to from the 19th. I'm not like that as a cantor, but for the most part, but certainly there's an influence of them, and that kind of Ashkenazic style, old school style. And I'll talk a little bit about the clergy in a while, but So those are a few things I just wanted to say in terms of laying the foundation, and Howard's mentioned the mikveh. I'll get back to the mikveh. But yes, it was the only one in Northern California. In fact, beyond Northern California, which is why they came, as Howard said, from other states. And it survived a little bit longer than the synagogue, up until 1980. Today, the synagogue, the main mikveh in the city. We now have all sorts of mikvahs run by Chabad and JCCs in the Bay Area, but not then. And so if you wished to observe a lifestyle of a woman of attending one monthly, or conversion, if you converted in the Bay Area, became a Jew by choice, that was it. That mikveh has a lot of history, a lot of kedusha to me, a holiness about it. And I thought it was gone forever. And only recently, a few weeks ago, found out it's still there. More on that soon. Stay tuned. I should also mention, I found out, I never thought about this as a kid, but Howard, I don't think said this, but if he did, I apologize for repeating it. So it's a California state landmark, which is why the front of it must remain as it is by law. So lucky for us, though the indoors are very different. And I'll speak a little about that as well. The exterior is as it was for decades. And that's why I think it's a really interesting thing. And lappage, is it lappage or lapage, Howard? I've never been sure about that, but lappage.
Lappage, yeah.
Lappage, yeah. It dead ends. I mean, it's a small street, right? Almost it goes today from Mission Minyan to Bnei David. It's interesting how history has evolved, but it dead ends into this synagogue. And there are people who come by it all the time. And I've seen on the internet things on websites where they say this is a tourist site. And I would beg to differ, because there are tenants there today. And I asked one of them, you get a lot of doorbells? He said, yes, I do. And so I would encourage people not to ring doorbells, even though I did that. So I'm saying, please do as I say and not as I did. But it is certainly a tourist site in terms of wanting to see something interesting and an important part of Jewish history in San Francisco. And I didn't know this. I'm not really familiar with the terminology, but even though we're saying these were proud and Orthodox Jews, the architecture was recessive, protective architecture, which I've learned it was built that way so as not to call attention to itself. So it's got this irony, right? It's a state landmark. It remains, but it was kind of built in a way so as not to, it's like most of the synagogues we probably attend, with parking lots and things like that, or major windows or displays. So a few things about my memory. I'm a Cantor today. I've been at my synagogue for many years, 28 years. And I grew up performing with my brother and my father at a lot of Jewish events. And not necessarily my sister, who I know is here somewhere in this crowd, but a shout out to her. But it was the three guys really who performed. And I didn't really think about this until tonight, that my first singing on a bima, my first performance on a bima, was at Congregation B'nai David. And I just, somewhere in my garage, I have a picture of that. I'm a percussionist and drummer, and my brother's a guitarist. And so I think my dad got us up there a few times. It's interesting that also you had this little place in the 60s and 70s, and this I would attribute to my father, that became a little bastion of Israeli culture. I know Howard shared with me, I don't know if we just went through it now, but there were, you know, for people who would know a name like Ran Eliran, who's still alive and well, but a pretty famous Israeli singer in his day, things like that, and Israeli holidays and just sing-alongs, things that wouldn't have been part of American Jewry, but and we don't have we did not then have the kind of Israeli community we do now in this high-tech world, but pretty much Israelis of the San Francisco area knew my parents, knew my father in particular, and there were a lot of things going on in this little Mission District Spanish-speaking community shul with Israelis coming in every so often, though wink, wink, not to the services. A few things about the maybe I'll get into the clergy in a minute, and I'll show pictures in a minute. But for those who have been there, you would remember that when you entered, if you went straight ahead, it was a 3-story building. You'd get to the social hall. There was a women's bathroom on the right, a men's bathroom on, as you entered, a men's bathroom on the right, men's bathroom on the left, and a pretty large social hall. To get to the synagogue, the sanctuary, you'd have to go up the stairs from either side. They met in the middle. To get to where women sat in the Ezrat Nashim, or the women's gallery, you'd have to go, or the religious school, the Sunday school, you'd have to go up another flight of stairs. And to get to the, actually, I should say the Sunday school, to get to the women's gallery, maybe like another half flight of stairs. So the women had to be more fit. I should mention, speaking of that at least in my days, and a friend of mine recently told me that even in the earlier 60s or 50s, to her memory, I don't know if she's here, it's still, women did not sit up there. And I think that's as a result of the numbers diminishing, and they were just small. They didn't hold fast to that. I remember the women's galleries being something I would run up and play on, and watch from above. And, if the kids would make noise, and there weren't a lot of kids, but if we were up there making noise, the Cantor, in his old school fashion, very sweet man. This is not in any way to critique him, but he'd give us a shh, shh, keep it quiet up there, in a way that generally clergy don't do today, usually. And so, yeah, I think I'll leave it at that for the building. It'll be more effective when I show a few pictures. The rabbi, Hyman Rogovin, did a little research on him too. I don't think I ever knew the rabbi or Cantor's first name until I was researching a few things for tonight. It was just Rabbi Rogovin and Cantor Berger. And the rabbi, to be honest, he might have spoken to me, but I don't remember speaking to him. He was, you got a feel of a holiness about him, and a kindness about him, and certainly a wisdom about him, scholarliness about him. I would love to read all these chat comments, so I apologize for not looking at them, but maybe if we switch back and forth, we can answer some of these things. So apologies for that. With his Russian accent, I learned later, it's incredible what you find on places like Ancestry.com and things like that. But he was born in Russia, and he came from Brooklyn. Lived later in Brooklyn in a home with his mother and his sister. He passed away in 1974. So last year, and I read, and I didn't know until I think it's something Howard shared with me, that Rabbi Traub, who many of you know, still with us. May be with us for many more years, but was the rabbi at Adath Israel in San Francisco, the Orthodox Shul in the Sunset, officiated at it. But I remember my father, as the Sunday school teacher as well, would bring him in sometimes to teach us, or over snacks, or so I do remember him well, and I was kind of just like Shapira. My name's Shapira, but the old Yiddish speakers would just call us Shapira, right? This is Shapira's boy, Shapira's boy. But I remember times, little things that stick out in my mind. For example, we didn't have a minyan. This is, again, Orthodox, only the men count. Moot point anyway, because it was only guys that showed up for the most part. He'd have me come sit on the bima and hold the Torah. I was a pretty dinky little kid in those days, and it was a little bit of a struggle, I remember, but at least for parts of the service, so that they could read the Torah service or maybe say Kaddish, I don't remember exactly. He'd have me up there. The Cantor, on the other hand, Cantor Berger, and I know very little about him or when he died or at the end of his days, but was this quirky, loving, giggly man. And I have a feeling his English wasn't as good as the rabbis, but he would always, I remember, it's the little things that stick out. He'd offer chewing gum to the kids. I was always there early because my father would open it up. So my relationship with these men was usually in the office a few minutes before. Chewing gum, want some chewing gum? Always offer chewing gum, I remember. Very sweet man, but, and I think probably if you think about the rabbis and cantors in your life, that might not be probably the more wacky or you know, maybe it's the music or the art in them, tend to be more the cantors than the rabbis anyway. So maybe that all works out, fits the stereotype, if I may use it. The religious school, certainly by the 60s and 70s, it was like a one school, kind of like some inner city, little house on the prairie, because there were maybe on a better day, maybe a dozen kids. Most days, probably less. And my father would teach us all. He was the school director and the teacher. And in one class only, there were 3 classrooms maybe. And the windows, we'll see them in a few moments, are on 19th. Like you look down onto 19th from there. It's a park next door, a little park next door, which when I visited recently saw, well, at some point it was connected with a bigger park. It's you know, behind it. Simchat Torah does stand out. It's interesting that Howard started out some of this with mention of it, but it does stand out as something really fun, Erev Simchat Torah. And it was the one, like if I have to think of one time when that place really came to life in a way, it was that, and the snacks and the flags and the singing and the dancing. I think that's probably enough of my memories, unless we maybe open it up for a little discussion. One day that sticks out in my mind, probably in my life, let alone in B'nai David history, is Yom Kippur 1973. We were not an Orthodox family. I grew up in the Richmond and we did drive to the synagogue. But even though I attended an Orthodox day school and an Orthodox synagogue, so it was very much a part of my life. But that day really stands out. And I remember there was an older man who really got upset with my father, who was in the office, not in the synagogue. But listen, you have to remember, we didn't know what was going down, right? We're listening to Golda Meir, and an old man really getting upset with my father for listening to the radio on Yom Kippur. I was a witness to that with his wife by his side. And it's the first time I'd ever seen my father, maybe not explode, but get upset in return with someone, and, you know, saying, you know, and I get it. He didn't know what was, again, it was a horrible day. But, you know, so there are a lot of memories from my youth from those things. There are others that I wrote down that I won't share right now. So I'm going to fast forward now a little bit to the late 70s, 1978. The board had decided it was time to close. You didn't even have a minion. You didn't have income. I mean, they were paying my father, but there's still bills, right? PG&E and whatever else. It was literally and figuratively dying. So the time had come. And I remember little stories that my father told me, because I always took an interest in this kind of stuff, like the parents of O.J. Simpson, who that's a horrible name for most today, but then he was this, wow, for a kid, O.J. Simpson, you know, the superstar, right? His parents were interested when it was for sale in, they took serious interest. I think it was his mother and stepfather or something like that, but O.J. Simpson's parents were seriously interested in this, this building for their church. And my dad, I remember, dealt with them. It didn't come to fruition, obviously. I remember in terms of the cleanup, because these are things you don't think about. What happens when a synagogue dies? Where do things go? And I remember by that time already, I was always really into studying about things Judaic, especially from bar mitzvah age on, I think. And some of you may remember the name Louis Freoff, who was a very close, I would say, my father would say, I think it's the only person I've ever heard him speak about in this way as a father figure outside of his own father in his life, who was at that time, director of Sinai Memorial Chapel, the Hebra Kadisha, and prior to that, the executive director of Temple Emmanuel. Anyway, he was the younger, I believe, brother of a legend in terms of response of the reform movement as a whole, Solomon B. Freedhoff, who just recently I had started reading about in a book called Guidance, Not Governance. This is Solomon Freedhoff. And I remember my dad coming home one night and saying he spent a big chunk of the day with Louis and Solomon Freedhoff going through these Jewish books. He said, Solomon Freedhoff was it B'nai David? Because his brother said, come over here. We just got all, you know, they needed, what do we save? What do we pass on? Where does this go? And I remember my father telling me it was like he had this computer mind, like the most obscure things. And my dad was fluent in Hebrew, but secular to a great degree. And these are things that I think, but Solomon Frioff, Rabbi Frioff, I should say, just this is that goes to this. This is written by this medieval guy. And interestingly enough, like a few nights ago, I was reading page 43 of this book, and it says, it's funny how things come together in life. It talks about Louis Frioff, his brother. It talks about Solomon Frioff's library and how later in life, his library also grew through the efforts of his brother Louis, who regularly collected unwanted Hebrew books from dying inner city synagogues and sent them on to him. So I guess B'nai David was not the only one. But here's the important part, I guess. When he eventually donated his collection of responsa to the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, so the headquarters of HUC in Cincinnati, it numbered over 3,000 volumes. It's very likely a lot of the books I grew up around in that synagogue are now at HUC. I've mentioned the last day, and I'll just maybe conclude with a couple of things right here. And Howard, feel free to chime in. I know I've been talking a lot and quickly, and I've been editing along the way, believe me, so much to tell. But I want to share some photos, and I want to just mention that, maybe I don't want to mention, well, we should talk about Frida Koblik, how, eventually this woman who died just not too long ago, in 2011, so a decade back, at the age of 90. She was born in 1920 in San Francisco, just blocks away as the daughter of Russian Jewish immigrants, and studied a lot of colleges here in SF State College, as it was called then, and became this major influence in the world of art. She taught acrylic casting techniques at the Royal College of Art. And in 1980, with the help of a friend, I want to get the name right, Marikita West, she was able to purchase, I'm reading this line off of Wikipedia, purchased the 4,300-foot former Congregation B'nai David building in the Mission District and maintained the space as both an art studio and residence. So it became this artists' co-op, really. And eventually, it's not that now, but it does have three. I read elsewhere that this was just an affluent friend who offered to buy her a disused San Francisco building in which she could live and work if she collaborated on its partial conversion to residential lofts, a type of project nearly unheard of in the city at the time. She lived there almost to the end of her days until she became very sick. So those are a few things, a few memories, a few of this really special place. And I would love to hear if there's anyone here that did attend the synagogue or go there, or especially if you had a life cycle event there, something like that. But I do want to share a screen now, and please, oh Lord, let this work. Okay, this is in no order. Let me just move you all over, no offense. This is in no order, and it probably should have been, so my apologies, but it's okay. I'm going to quickly go through them. This is that park I was talking about, just not right next door. There's one building in between. It was this little dingy park when I was there, and they've broadened it and made it real. And when I visited a few weeks ago, I took a little stroll through it and was pleased to see just how clean it was and how wonderful towards the back there, and a lot of families with little kids. Many Spanish-speaking families there still. So I should mention before moving on, I'm going to leave it on this picture for a moment. I drove to B'nai David about 3 weeks ago, something like that. And I said, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to try and get in there for the first time in 43 years. And it's kind of weird because you don't want to bother tenants, right? You want to respect their privacy in this. And I tried, I don't want to mention any names, and I don't know if he's here, but I tried, I rang all the tenants' bells and no one was there. This is late morning on a weekday. It doesn't surprise me. But I thought, what the heck? There's the little door to the mikvah. I'll show that to you in a minute. You know, it still stands. It's painted red. It's different. There's a doorbell there still. It looks like the same doorbell from when I was there 40 and 50 years before. And at first the gentleman says, I'm a very sweet man, older man, says, it's not really at its cleanest right now, and I'm doing things, and sort of like my head hanging down. I said, no, I totally understand, sir, and thank you anyway. I brought your flyer, Howard, the brochure, because I wanted him to make sure that this wasn't some, crazy man just trying to get into his building. And I even said, I won't ask to come in. Could I just take a picture of. And then he and someone who, I think a younger woman who helps him out, came out, and they saw I was still there. And I think it dawned on him when I explained to him what this was all about, and I was preparing for a little presentation here. He said, well, let me let you in. Let me come in with me. And he gave me a lot of information. And that's when I said, I asked, are you Jewish? No, he's the son of Italian immigrants, and he's Catholic, but he knows a lot about the history of this place. He takes an interest. And I said, I don't know if you know what this is, but where you are, there used to be a mikveh here. And he looked at me and said, it still is. I said, it still is? He said, come on down, follow me. And so I was at this mikveh, and I remember the mikveh, I should have said, was, for those, I know there's always baggage now when you mentioned Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, who in many ways was a tremendous influence on me. And for those who would remember, when I was young, even at the day school, we'd have these Jewish hippies from the House of Love and Prayer, barefoot, coming to visit and help out and do things like that. And I remember my father, towards the end of his days, sharing with me how often on most Fridays, this group from the House of Love and Prayer would come on Friday afternoons and dip in the mikveh when men do. That's still often a minhag, a tradition in many mikvahs. And that always, when Shlomo Carlebach was there, he would come with them, of course. And so he would take a dip in this mikveh, and that's how my dad knew Rabbi Carlebach. But I'll show you the mikveh right now. This is the founding stone from 1908. It's as you enter the mikveh side on the left side. I didn't know anything about it. This very nice man, I don't want to mention his name again, but it said, let me show you it. So I took a picture. There he actually is. But this is the backyard. I remember being here often. I remember the sukkah from it. I remember like a very nice older couple over this fence, often like, this was a different day and time, but offering me candy and things like that. The social hall I mentioned is one of the units. So you walk straight through towards the mikveh, but towards the back. This is I did the best I could. There were lights reflecting on it, but this is what the inner sanctuary looked like. You're looking at it from the bima towards the back. So that door in the very back is where you'd come in. This was all men traditionally, but again, I'd never seen it that way. Everything going all the way around is the woman's gallery. They've really maintained a respect for what it was, because I didn't expect to see photos or things relating to its history. I just thought they made these lofts and they're tenants now. But here it is. This is in the main area there at the bottom. It's a shared area by the tenants. History of the Bnei David Synagogue. It talks about its history. This is what would have been the main entrance into the sanctuary, where one of the tenants' bikes is. This is on the, you may remember I said you go up from the right or the left, but on the right-hand side, this is where I went up the most, because it's how you got to the religious school. Or if you wanted to go through that door right where you're looking, you get up to the women's gallery. Nothing really has changed about it. I was shocked to see this podium from the sanctuary. It's right there. This is not in the sanctuary. I could not get into the sanctuary in a way. But in a way I did. The fixtures are still the same from 100 years ago. This is a view. You see me in the reflection taking a picture, but I was pleasantly surprised to see this. This is a view from the women's gallery, right, looking down. I'll quickly go. It's hard to see, but all these guys in top hats, this is the founding of it in 1908. This is looking down from the women's gallery at one of the units. I also want to respect everybody, and that's looking up at it today. These were emotional moments for me, because I didn't expect to get into the building. I certainly didn't necessarily get expect to get into the sanctuary where I spent so many hours as a youth. The windows are all the same. These, I'm almost done. There's only a handful more. This one kind of saddens me because for all of the holiness and specialness I felt of what this meant in San Francisco and Bay Area and northern United States, northwestern United States Jewish history, this is the mikvah. Kind of used as storage. The tenant is not to be blamed, and I'm not even blaming the owner. He may not even know what this is, but he told me I have nothing to do with this, but he has access to it, so he showed it to me. This, he said, all of these storage boxes and whatever are the owners doing. But this is looking down at it. This is me standing inside the mikvah looking up. As you may know, there are 7 steps going up and down into a mikvah. This is again, a view from the top. It's just this messy place where they're storing things, but that's the mikvah, which today, and they even have signs from those days. Mikvah Yisrael, this is the other, for those who can read Hebrew or Yiddish, congregation B'nai David, and the other B'nai David, the other side talks about it being a mikveh. Howard showed some of these things. This is close-ups of the exterior of the building. That's the door into the mikveh. Do not disturb. Yeah, so very special memories of a very special place. And I never, if Howard had not said, you're one of a few that has memories of this place, would you share? I probably wouldn't have thought to do all this, or probably wouldn't have rung a bell to try and get in again. Over to you, Howard. Where do we go next? I mean, let me just see if there's anything. I will say this, the gentleman, it's interesting because, it's just a block and a half away from Mission Dolores Playground, Park. And the playground there is the Helen Diller Playground now. So there continues to be, when I was there, it was a very Hispanic neighborhood. It's more diverse now, and Jews have come back, as was mentioned. The Mission Minyan and Shar Zahav is close by. Yes, these are rentals. I just saw that one for the first time. I would love to look through all these chats in a moment, but the gentleman who, again, is not Jewish said he wishes that there's a lot of history here, and he wishes that the Jewish community would take it back. It's come from an old Catholic man. And I said, who's to say? Maybe, you'd never want to kick out tenants, of course, but eventually, but wouldn't that be something special,
Well, the truth is, I'm sure there are some people on this call who are experiencing great frustration when you say that, because there was an effort on the part of some of the people involved in the Mission Minyan.
Correct. We should, yes, I know.
To actually try to make that a nonprofit that would be a Jewish space and be the home to the Minyan as well as to other organizations. But yeah, they are, to answer a couple of questions in the chat, they are private residents now, rentals.
Which is why I emphasize please don't. Consider this your glimpse into it. I'm just gonna, unless Howard, I know you were gonna share as well about other synagogues that used to exist in the city.
Yeah, so I'll talk at the end, but if you did want, because there are people with particular memories here, I don't know how you wanted to do this, Doron, if you wanted to.
Let me bring it on the gallery view. Maybe if there's anyone who just wishes to, and if there's anyone here who, I saw Audrey, you just had a memory, or anyone else who has any memories, feel free. Do we have the ability to do that, our directors, to unmute? Okay. Gita, please. I'll spotlight you if I have that power here. All right. Gita is a friend and congregant of mine as well. Yes. You were going to say something. You have to unmute, though. Can you unmute? No.
Try now.
Okay.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Okay. Hi. Yeah, I don't want to take up too much time. I was born and raised in San Francisco in the early 1950s. And my child, as far as Beth David goes, that's where, as I said before, I did go in the mikveh in December of 1974 on the eve of getting married. which was by Rabbi Traub at Dath Israel at the time. But the talking of vanishing synagogues, I believe it no longer exists. My childhood synagogue was Knesset Israel, and Howard said he might talk briefly about it. And that was on Webster Street. And I even, because I didn't remember the name of it from my childhood, we eventually moved in the 60s to the Sunset District. But I found some great articles. I can't believe the long, I really wasn't aware of the long history of Jews in San Francisco, in all those parts of town. But anyway, I have many memories. As far as the structure of Knesset Israel, the facade looked much like Beth David from my childhood recollections.
B'nai David,
excuse me. Yeah, just flat, nothing, the name, the door was the same. It was modeled on the East European synagogues. It was Orthodox. The bima was in the center, a bit raised. The men sat downstairs all around, and the women sat in a big gallery upstairs. And it was a very busy street. And sad to say that one other recollection is maybe when in 58 or 59, I was 6, 7, on Yom Kippur, of all things, many of the children would play out on the sidewalk in front of the synagogue. Right? And that was a very busy street, very busy area. And I just followed older kids into the street, jaywalking to cross the street.
Yeah.
And I was hit by a car on Yom Kippur.
Oh my gosh.
It was the things we remember, the things that we have. But that whole district, McAllister Street, all the merchants where my mother, I would go grocery shopping with her. I mean, I can still smell it and see it. But
thanks for sharing.
I don't know too much specifically what happened to that synagogue later. As far as I know, it was desecrated, I believe, and shut down, I think. I don't know for sure.
We have a scholar here that can answer some of that.
Not a scholar, but I will talk
and it
about
ain't me.
in a second.
Thank you, Gita. Maybe we should just see if there's anyone else really quickly. If I switch to gallery, and if not, we'll hand it over to Howard. And I'll thank you for tuning into my part.
Marilyn. Oh, and
yeah.
Audrey.
Marilyn Hoffman and Audrey. We'll get to you, Audrey, in a second. Marilyn, is that you?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, you're on.
Hi. So I mean, this brought back a lot of memories for me. I grew up in San Francisco and went to B'nai David with my grandma and my mother and aunt, and we always sat upstairs, and they wore these little fur, I don't know, like stoles with little minky things that you would click. And I really remember the Cantor going when it got too loud, and I didn't understand a word of what was going on. But I
have never tried that technique in my whole career.
You should try it, but I'm sure it works. Shaw. Yeah. But mostly the high holidays, and I'd see the same children year after year, and a couple of the members who would bring lollipops and play in the park. And there was besides the park, there was like a kind of like equivalent to like a Mel's Drive-In around the corner on Valencia.
Yes.
And go down there and get hamburgers and French fries.
If someone named Audrey is here, I would love to.
Yeah.
I would love to. No, not Audrey. Sorry. Who was it that was telling? What? Anyway, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Anyway, and my grandmother lived in the Mission. My mom was married in the house in the Mission. My uncle owned the competitive furniture store down the block called All American Interiors. And we spent a lot of time in the Mission. And then also in the Fillmore too, went to those delis and then eventually joined Beth Israel as a synagogue. So it was just really nice to see it again through your slides and your stories. Appreciate it.
Tuning in.
Both of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn. Wait, okay, Audrey, you were going to say something.
So I was just going to say, I know you talked to Marcia the other day about the synagogue.
Oh, that's right. It was Marcia who was telling me about playing at the park, and yes, right.
Yes, so I went with her one year on Rosh Hashanah. We must have been in maybe 6th or 7th grade. And I remember, because my family was not observant and I didn't go to services. My father wouldn't let me stay home on the holidays unless I went to services. So I went with Marcia one year. Yeah. And I remember sitting up there and really liking to see all the men praying down below. But then Marcia dragged me outside. We went out to the playground. So I wasn't really in there for very long.
Marcia told me that a lot of her, and that's why when a restaurant was mentioned, or like a lot of them, like I guess with many shuls, it's the area or neighborhood you remember as well. And what, I remember this Anna's Danish cookies, which were not kosher, but used to be right by there, and they're now in San Mateo, but yeah.
And then as I mentioned to the email to you, that Meyer Hirsch was Faye's uncle. And also Sam Hertzberg's great aunt was married to him. We just made that connection recently.
People most wouldn't know, but
so yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Howard. Well,
Gerald wanted to say something.
Sure. Let's bring on Gerald. You have him, Noah, or?
Just a moment.
It's a nice crowd today, Sam. It's over 100 people.
Got it unmuted now.
Yeah.
I grew up in San Francisco in the 40s, and my grandmother and my mother and father attended B'nai David. My grandmother and I used to sit up in the women's section before I made bar mitzvah. And when I made bar mitzvah, it was quite an accomplishment to go down and sit with the men. But I still remember going, I went to the playground for a little break afterwards and enjoyed that. They had a great jungle gym there that I used to play on. And I also remember, of course, going to McAllister Street to do all the shopping, the delis and the bakery there. It was really wonderful. My grandfather headed the Hever Kadisha. Now, he passed away in the 30s before I was born. But after the earthquake and fire, the whole family moved down to the cemetery, down to Colma, because their house was burned. And I still have the Shabbat candlesticks that the house was burning. He went in and saved them. And we still have them today.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you, Gerald. I just wanted to mention before we go to anyone else, that I was quickly looking at some of these, and yes, Renee mentioned Frida's ashes are near a tree behind the synagogue. I had no idea about that part. I understand there are 4 apartment rentals, correct. I know there are at least 3, but 4 sounds right. And if you look online, there are, I think, things Howard had where I saw what they looked like when they were first made. I'm just quickly looking at some of these because someone said something else that are these rentals? Yes, they are rentals. And I guess there's something else I wanted to see, but I'll move on. So I know there are quickly. Okay, over to you, Howard. Thank you all so much for having me here. Unless there's, I'm happy to chime in later, but I know Howard's got more expertise on other shuls or synagogues for those who wish to.
So I'm going to, I didn't know how long this program would end up being. So I did what I'm going to do is a fairly quick going through of just a portion of synagogues in addition to B'nai David that are no longer part of our life in San Francisco. And I'll just do this, a little quickly. If you're only interested in B'nai David, don't feel, I'm not insulted if you leave, but if you want to learn more about some of these other parts of our history, I'm going to go ahead and share this. So I'll just take 1 second. Do you see that? Okay, great. So these are the names of some of the synagogues that once operated in San Francisco, overwhelmingly Orthodox. And when I talk about vanished synagogues, I'm talking about the organization itself and not the building. There are buildings that are still around where, I mean, synagogues where they no longer have their former buildings. But there are also vanished buildings. There are also cases where the synagogue may be gone, but the building is still extant. And I'm actually going to talk about those first. So a lot of you are probably familiar with this building. This is the old Ohabe Shalom synagogue on Bush Street, which is now an assisted living home, primarily for Japanese American seniors. And that congregation began downtown. Ohabe Shalom was first founded in 1864 as a break-off group from Congregation Emmanuel. And as Emmanuel continued to adopt more of the practices of the Reform movement, those who resisted those changes often gravitated to Ohabe Shalom. This is a picture taken in 1868 of their synagogue at Mason Street between Geary and Post. And you can actually see beyond it, you can see the towers of the old Congregation Emmanuel building on Sutter in the background. In 1895, the congregation built a new Moorish-style synagogue on Bush Street near Laguna, as many Jews were now moving west of Van Ness. And this was a large synagogue that could accommodate 1,000 people. You'll see that the elaborate towers that you just saw did not actually last very long. And the congregation suffered financially and eventually put the building up for sale in 1934. Where they ended up, the congregation actually moved to the synagogue on 4th Avenue between Geary and Clement, that many of you would know today as Magen David Sephardic Congregation. But at the time they moved into it in the 1930s, Congregation Beth Shalom had just vacated it in order to move to its new home on 14th Avenue. So it was basically taken up by Ohabe Shalom. That building originally actually was built as a Baptist church. The synagogue on Bush Street was purchased by Japanese Buddhists who turned it into the Sokoji temple building. And it was also the birthplace of the San Francisco Zen Center. And here's a photo from 1962 in association with a Buddhist ceremony. It was designated a city landmark in 1976, and after the Sokoji temple moved in 1984, there was an effort led by Felix Warburg, whom you see here, to turn it into a Jewish cultural center. But meanwhile, the building was falling into worse and worse disrepair. The building was eventually granted by the Redevelopment Agency to the Japanese American Religious Federation in 1996, and they developed the present senior home. And here are then and now pictures. So I'm going to talk about the Portola District, which many people, even knowledgeable about Jewish San Francisco, don't know much about. The Portola District housed a significant Jewish community revolving around San Bruno Road. The community was often called Little Jerusalem, although it was known within the Jewish world as Out the Road. There were several synagogues, kosher butchers and delis, and a settlement house and other institutions. And the two principal synagogues that functioned at the time still exist today in different manners. So the very modest congregation Mokum Israel has been since 1968 a Ukrainian Catholic church. And you can see the interior here. And just as in the case of B'nai David, that's what you're seeing on the sides are the women's gallery. And here's a view from what was the women's gallery. Ahavat Achim was a larger synagogue on Felton Street at Girard. And after many of the area's Jews had moved away and a merger of Ahavat Achim and Mokum Israel actually failed, the building was sold to the Portola Baptist Church in the late 1940s and is today the San Francisco, I don't know how to say the word, Apostolic Assembly of the Faith. What is really neat is that if you come to this side of the building, you see that the Star of David in the window is still there. And if you know of other buildings that are still around that were formerly synagogues, I'm all ears and I'm very interested. But I want to talk particularly, since it was very active in the chat, to talk about Knesset Israel as a particularly significant shul that is no longer part of the city's landscape. So, I skipped this thing. So Knesset Israel was actually formed from the combination of two synagogues at the end of the 19th century. One was Beth Menachem Streisand, which had been on Minna Street. That's between 4th and 5th. And actually, many of you would recognize it now as the alley that one takes to get out of the Metreon parking lot. And the other was Neve Tzedek, which was on Mission between 5th and 6th. So those were two synagogues that served the South of Market community. And they united under a new name, Knesset Israel. The idea was to create a new and large synagogue, and it was announced that it would be built on Russ Street, which is between 6th and 7th. The site was between 6th and 7th streets and between Howard and Folsom. And here's a photograph of the new building when it was completed in September 1903. Here's an account of a service at the shul that I really love. And if you can't read it, it says, at the new synagogue of the Knesset Israel on Russ Street, two congregations worshiped at the same time, or the two sections of one congregation held services in different parts of the synagogue. Reverend Hyman Samuelson chanted the Kol Nidre Musaf in the Ne'ilah services in the ancient, traditional, and weird tones, like the echoes of past ages and dead centuries. He was assisted by a choir of 12 boys and young men, and A.M. Summer recited the Shachrit ritual and B. Shapira the Mincha service. The lower hall, called the Beit HaMidrash, was occupied by the ultra-Orthodox faction, with etc. So there's much to unpack here, but it's always incredible. And I've shared a lot of these articles from the Chronicle and the Call and the Examiner. It's remarkable to me how much of this inner Jewish history was actually recorded in the mainstream press. As I mentioned before, the fire destroyed South of Market, and tragically, this is what Russ Street looked like after the fire in April 1906. And here's an account of some of the devastated synagogues in the area. Quite a few of the synagogues were destitute at this point, but Knesset Israel actually then ended up having a very strange windfall. Congregation Beth Israel had had several locations over its history and had vacated its most recent one on Geary and Laguna after building this larger one at Geary and Fillmore. A philanthropist named William Wolfe purchased Beth Israel's old building in order to have a synagogue that would offer free services and education. He offered to give it to Knesset Israel with a stipulation that the synagogue would change its name to the William Wolfe Congregation. And so for a number of years, Knesset Israel was the William Wolfe Congregation at Geary and Laguna. I'm not totally clear on the circumstances, but after William Wolfe died, the congregation sought to release themselves both from the building and from his name. They built a new building on Webster between McAllister and Golden Gate in the heart of the Jewish section of the Fillmore. There were 2 kosher restaurants on this block alone. In 1920, they installed Wolf Gold as the rabbi. He was a major leader among Orthodox Zionists. Known as the Webster Street Shul, this was now the largest Orthodox synagogue in the city. Sadly, then in 1929, their building was again destroyed by fire. The congregation met on Grove Street while they rebuilt, and then they rededicated their new building in 1930. And here is the rebuilt synagogue. You can see the entrance. And sadly, the congregation would decline over the decades with many of the same factors that affected B'nai David, the movement of Jews to the avenues and then the suburbs. Knesset Israel, though, was also affected by a much worse twist, which was the redevelopment of the Fillmore district. And we could spend a whole program just on redevelopment and what it did to the Fillmore. but the neighborhood went into an accentuated decline beginning from in the late 1950s through the 1970s. Knesset Israel suffered numerous cases of vandalism and eventually gave up entirely on the neighborhood in 1972. The synagogue was boarded up, as you can see here, and it was then torn down. And the congregation moved to a succession of office buildings, and the number of people involved with it withered. The final phase was actually quite poignant. Henry Falconberg, who's pictured here, I don't have a better picture, unfortunately, was a Holocaust survivor who had gotten out of Europe in 1942 and came to San Francisco. He joined Knesset Israel upon coming to the city, and though not a rabbi, he was deeply involved throughout the years. And in its final decades, he really ran the show. He would lead it and teach classes. And located downtown, it served primarily as a place where tourists and business travelers who were staying downtown could pray and have a meal together during Shabbat and holidays. And he did it all. He cooked the food, he ran the services, and he was extremely welcoming. I experienced him myself, and he was just a really wonderful man. Here was its last location. This is on Sutter Street. The shul was actually in the basement. If you can see underneath that, that set of windows, there's a little, it was in that basement. And I think there were maybe no more than 30 seats in the whole place. Falconberg died in 2017. And with him, to my knowledge, also went the shul. So his memory is a blessing. And it's a sad ending to a very long story for this major shul. So I'm very conscious of the time, so I'm going to actually cut it there and offer. I know there are people with also connections to some of these shuls. Basically, if you want to go, you can go. And if there's anybody who would like to share some memories, then by all means, I would love it if you would do so, including, I know there are some people with connections to there's one with a family connection to Ahavat Achim. So
Howard, could I just say two last things, only in response to chat comments, and then we can do, that was such a thorough, man, you think you know San Francisco Jewish history. And then you deal with Howard Friedman, who shares so much in just a few moments. A question came up about the Bima. Yeah, it was not, there were two things that were a little bit different from many Orthodox synagogues. You're correct. Someone mentioned it looked like in the pictures it was frontal, and it was not center with seating all the way around it. And there was a question about wall hangings and things like that. It was pretty sparse, but I do remember something, and I can just see it exactly in my head. There were these paintings towards the back inside the sanctuary, which is rare for an Orthodox synagogue, of people. Moses and Aaron, I believe, two different paintings. Moses, and even with like the rays of light, almost in a Western way, but not horns. But it was many Orthodox shuls will not put paintings of people or pictures, anything iconographic, if I'm using the word correctly, in them. But towards the back, we did have those on the bottom on the men's section, but otherwise there was not much there, though the windows are really cool, I think, still. And that was, those are my last comments. I'm just so honored to have been here and shared with Howard, and now I'll just listen. So thank you for having me.
Great, so maybe I'll call on Susan Diamond, who has her hand up. Can you unmute?
You should be able to unmute now, Susan.
Maybe that's, why don't we'll go back to Susan and ask Judy, Judy Leff. Hi, Judy. Can you unmute? It's not working. Okay.
We got you for a second and then it went back.
Okay, how about now?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. I wanted to say that something exciting is going to happen beginning of next year, at Temple Emmanuel, I was able to get a grant to have 14 reels of microfilm from Jewish newspapers in the 19th century, actually scanned and digitized and OCR scanned, which is going to reveal a lot more information about these smaller synagogues and what life was like in Jewish San Francisco, especially in places like the Mission and so on. This is through a program called California Revealed. And just to let anybody who's interested in this or researchers know, check the California Revealed website, maybe around March or April, to see if these San Francisco Jewish neighborhood newspapers have been put up on the website. It's going to be a lot of information.
Wow, that is fantastic. Thank you, G. I mean, I love going back. I mean, there's such a, it's an incredibly rich picture going back to try to recreate life through these. And we have to remember that there was no, no TV, no internet, no radio and stuff. So the people put a lot of effort into writing, and it actually is a much richer picture than people I imagine think. So thank you. Okay, let's try, Susan, are you able to unmute? Okay, then I have somebody on the phone who's, says
hi.
iPhone. Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
No, my name is Michelle Newberg and I was listening. Thank you so much. Was there a synagogue in North Beach? Because every day I passed there and it seemed like there was a plaque that said, hey, here is where the first services, High Holy Day services were held. And there's a building, I think it's a Christian Science building now, and it has Magen David's on the outside.
Not to my knowledge. Judy might know better about. I mean, there were some of the original synagogues were, in the far eastern part of downtown. I don't know that they would have gone as far as North Beach, but
Howard, I have read about that, and I believe that you're talking about like as in the Wild West days.
Yes, I'm talking about original San Francisco.
Yes, I've seen pictures of that as well. Yeah, that predates all of this, pre 20th century.
There we go. Hi, yes, that is supposedly the site of the 1849 High Holy Day services. Yeah. The one time the Jews got along.
Yeah. And Fred Rosenbaum does write about that one. So
yes, but that's supposed to be the tent store of Louis Franklin, who was a Silesian Jew.
Yeah, right.
There's some debate whether there was one service or actually two services, because maybe we were already not getting along. But that's what that plaque is supposed to be for, is the site of Louis Franklin's tent store in 1849.
Can't we all just get along?
Okay, looks like we have Susan back with us. Susan, can you unmute?
Hello? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Anyway, my husband just informed me that his great uncle's father was an Orthodox rabbi in the 1900s in one of those synagogues in San Francisco. And his great uncle was Rabbi Bill Stern at Temple Sinai in Oakland. And Bill became a Reform rabbi. But his father, Stern Sayer, is that right, Steve? Was an Orthodox rabbi. So I'm just sharing that. And we're trying to find out the name of the synagogue. I just want to thank you so much for this program. It has been so meaningful and so well done. And I'd love to hear more about Jewish history in San Francisco at another time. I have read a few books.
Thank you. So maybe Bess, can you?
Hi. So my grandfather came from Manchuria to be the rabbi at Congregation Ahavat Achim in 1926. And that's how my family was able to come to America, because he was a minister And so they, and I have the paperwork confirming his appointment. And when I think it was the American Jewish Committee back in 2010 did the Jews in China exhibit, the part of this was displayed. So my father came over in 1927 with his mother and his other 3 siblings and grew up in the Portola District. And his joke was that the poor Jews lived in the Fillmore District and the really poor Jews lived out in the Portola District. And my grandfather also was a shochet, and he worked as an upholsterer. And I never met him. He died before World War II. So that's my family connection to that synagogue.
That is really great. Thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate it. Sandra, are you able to unmute?
Now I am,
Great.
yeah. I wanted to say thank you. I really appreciate this along with everybody else. It's amazing what you did. Frida Koblik is my family member. So I spent a lot of time in B'nai David. I also used that mikveh once. I want to recommend that people watch her video, the one that I posted on there, because it's very informative and she's a really interesting person. So she herself is the one that made sure those pictures were up on the wall of the old synagogue, and that she also preserved it as a historic building, made sure it was a historic monument.
Thank you for sharing that. I don't recall ever meeting her, but I wish I did.
Well, when you meet her on the video, you'll wish you did.
Yeah.
I also want to say I was associated with Knesset Israel for many years. After it moved to the Jack Tar building, I started going to shul there. I knew Henry really well. Yes, as you said, Howard, he single-handedly carried that synagogue. He was the steward of the synagogue. He wasn't formally a rabbi, but he could have been. He was very, very deeply learned. and when he was dying, he signed it over to Chabad. I'm very glad personally that it's still a Jewish space, and it's open on Shabbat. And even though it is the basement, I think it was a law office before Henry found it, and it's a really nice basement. It's a nice place to go. Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, he was very, very learned, and it was kind of remarkable for, and he also just sort of brought this old world demeanor with him that was, sort of reflecting a little what Doron was talking about with being with that other generation. Does anybody else have anything else? It's getting late, but is anybody, if anybody else does want to chime in with a memory or a comment, you can feel free to raise your hand on the little thing or make a quick note in the chat, and we can call on you. We will send something out tomorrow with some links, including the link to the video. I absolutely concur with Sandra that the video with Frida Koblik is wonderful. She has a great presence, and you do see more of the shul. So we do have somebody, it looks like. I'm gonna ask to unmute there.
I just have a question. I wish I had something more to add, but do you know when that building was for sale? Because I remember it being for sale, and it was when I was looking for a house. So does anyone know what years it was for sale? I'm just curious.
Which building are we talking about?
The building in the Mission.
B'nai David. It looks like it was sold in 2014 was the last.
Most recent.
No, I'm talking about it was either this.
Earlier was in 1980.
Okay.
Is when Frida Koblik.
That's when it was purchased. It closed down in autumn of '78, and then exactly 1980. It was fine. Everything was finalized, and the mikvah was shut down, and I mean the new mikvah was brought in. So.
Right, and a condition of the sale, by the way, was that the mikveh would have to be continued, even though the synagogue no longer held services. The mikveh would actually need to continue to be accessible to people. And that was the case it really ended up being less than 2 years, because then the new mikveh on Sacramento Street opened. And that mikveh is actually called Mikveh Israel, the same name of the 19th Street mikveh. So that's the official.
And B'nai David, that's full name is.
And B'nai, yeah.
Mikveh Israel, B'nai David,
Yeah.
merged all the names into it. So.
Yeah, so but that continuity is there. But they honored that. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for staying with us. Oh no, it looks like we have one more person, so I'm sorry.
Here she comes.
Okay.
I want to know where the Torah went that was hidden in your closet.
I know that it went to Sinai Memorial Chapel. I would have to do a little research to see if it's still, I believe Sinai keeps some Torahs in terms of morning practices or shivas or things like that. I believe, I don't want to be quoted on this, but I will check it out. But that's where I'm 90% sure. My father told me that's where it went, and that they then either sold it or moved it on to, so I'll do a little research. Get the word out to Howard, who can put it out to others.
Great. I also want to, in addition to what Judy mentioned about the fantastic project that she's working on, I do know that Jay is working on having its own archives digitized right now, and I think there is going to be, keep your ears out similarly for announcements next year about being able to access old copies of the Jewish Bulletin Manual. And so that'll also open up some of this history to us, because we have just such a rich history, and it's wonderful. Though as much as it's lovely to go back in all the archives, I really love hearing personal experiences, because ultimately it's really about people. And so thank you very much, everybody. Stay safe. Thank you, Doron. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. And till next time.
What an honor. Have a great night.
Thank you, Howard. Thank you, Doron. Take care.
Pleasure.